A powerful judge, feared and untouchable, slams the gavel. Two innocent black twins are found guilty. He expects tears, outrage, begging. But instead, they look straight into his eyes and say something that chills him to the bone. His hands tremble. His heart pounds. Because he knows the truth. He framed them. And now those words, simple, haunting, and impossible to ignore, won't let him sleep. As his world crumbles around him, the guilt consumes him. But it's too late to turn back. Or is it? What did they say that made a powerful man panic? And how far will he go to silence the truth? Stay until the end to witness a shocking redemption you'll never forget. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Judge Theodore Caldwell's courtroom always carried a certain weight, but today the air felt particularly heavy. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. His black robe rustled softly as he walked to his bench, each step measured and deliberate. The familiar smell of old wood and leather-bound law books did nothing to settle the unease in his stomach. His fingers brushed against the smooth wooden surface of his bench, a gesture that usually brought comfort but today felt empty. The Carter twins sat before him, their matching sky-blue dresses pressed and proper. Their hands were clasped together, fingers intertwined so tightly their knuckles had turned white. But it was their faces that caught his attention. Calm, composed, almost serene despite the circumstances. Behind them, their mother Eleanor clutched her Bible like a lifeline, her lips moving in silent prayer. The worn leather cover of her Bible bore the marks of countless hours of devotion. The jury foreman rose slowly, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Caldwell noticed how the man's Adam's apple bobbed nervously before he spoke the single word that would change everything. Guilty. Sweat beaded on the foreman's forehead as he struggled to maintain his composure. The word hung in the air for a moment before chaos erupted. Gasps rippled through the courtroom like a wave. Someone in the back row let out a muffled cry. Eleanor Carter's sob cut through the noise, a raw, broken sound that made Caldwell's chest tighten unexpectedly. Her Bible slipped from her trembling fingers, landing with a soft thud on the wooden floor. The twins didn't cry out. They didn't collapse or scream. Instead, they squeezed each other's hands tighter, their shoulders touching, drawing strength from each other. Their faces remained composed, though their eyes now shimmered with unshed tears. A single strand of hair had come loose from one twin's neat braid, but she made no move to fix it. "This is a miscarriage of justice." Michael Harrington's voice boomed across the courtroom as he shot to his feet. His face had turned red, and his tie was slightly askew. "There was no evidence?" His briefcase toppled over, sending papers scattering across the floor. Caldwell's gavel came down hard, once, twice. The familiar sound of wood striking wood usually brought him comfort, but today it felt hollow. "Order," he commanded, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The wood of the gavel felt slick against his palm. From his position on the bench, he could see Daniel Whitmore in the back row. The businessman sat with his legs crossed casually, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. His expensive suit seemed to mock the twins' simple dresses, his satisfaction a sharp contrast to their quiet dignity. He adjusted his gold cufflinks with deliberate slowness, drawing attention to their gleam. The noise in the courtroom swelled again. Whispers, cries, the scraping of chairs. Caldwell raised his gavel once more, bringing it down with enough force to make the sound echo off the walls. The room fell silent, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. That's when it happened. The twins turned to face him, their movements perfectly synchronized. Their eyes, so young, yet filled with an wisdom beyond their years, met his directly. Their voices, soft but clear, carried across the suddenly quiet room. "We forgive you." The words seemed to hover in the air like morning mist. 4 simple words. They shouldn't have affected him. He'd heard far more dramatic statements in his courtroom over the years. But something about their quiet certainty, the complete lack of hatred in their eyes, sent an unexpected chill down his spine. His grip on the gavel tightened until his knuckles turned white, matching the twins' own clasped hands. A drop of sweat rolled down his temple. He hadn't expected this. Anger, yes. Tears, certainly. Even curses wouldn't have surprised him. But forgiveness? His collar suddenly felt too tight, and the weight of his robes seemed to increase tenfold. Those steady eyes continued to look at him, not with accusation or hatred, but with something far more unsettling: compassion. The gold cross pendant One Twin wore caught the sunlight, sending a brief flash across his face. The room remained frozen in that moment, the silence broken only by Eleanor Carter's quiet weeping and the subtle creak of wooden benches as spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The late morning sun continued to stream through the windows, but Caldwell felt cold. A shadow from a passing cloud briefly darkened the room, as if nature itself was marking the gravity of the moment. The grandfather clock in Judge Caldwell's study struck 10:30, each chime echoing through the quiet house like an accusation. He sat in his leather chair, surrounded by the trappings of success, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound law books, certificates in gilded frames, and the expensive mahogany furniture that spoke of power and privilege. The room smelled of old paper and polished wood, a scent that usually brought him comfort but tonight only added to his unease. A crystal tumbler of whiskey sat untouched on his desk, amber liquid catching the dim light from his desk lamp. The ice had long since melted, diluting the expensive spirit, creating lazy swirls in the glass. His head throbbed as he rubbed his temples, trying to focus on the open case files before him. But the words kept swimming, replaced by two simple sentences that wouldn't leave him alone, that seemed to pulse with each beat of his heart. "We forgive you." The twins' voices, so clear and unified, haunted him. Their eyes had held no hatred, no anger, just a quiet acceptance that made his stomach turn. The memory of their steady gazes burned into his conscience like a brand. They were guilty, he muttered to himself, shuffling through the papers for the 100th time, the sound of rustling documents filling the heavy silence. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew better. No. Whitmore made them guilty. The name felt bitter on his tongue. His hands trembled slightly as he reread the case file, the familiar weight of compromise settling on his shoulders. The so-called evidence was paper-thin. The prosecution's star witness had changed his story 3 times, each version more convenient than the last. The security footage was grainy, inconclusive, showing nothing more than shadows and movement. Any other day, any other case, he would have thrown it out without a second thought. The soft padding of feet made him look up. Margaret stood in the doorway wrapped in an expensive silk nightgown, her manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of red wine. Her face, carefully maintained through years of treatments and procedures, showed mild curiosity as she studied him. The dim light softened her features, but couldn't hide the calculating look in her eyes. "You're pale," she observed, taking a slow sip of wine, the crystal catching the light. "Like you've seen a ghost." Caldwell waved her off, his shoulders tense. Long day at court. The lie felt heavy in his mouth. Margaret's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched slightly. She'd been his wife for 25 years, long enough to read the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands. Her eyes narrowed, unconvinced by his casual dismissal. She lingered a moment longer before turning away, her silk robe whispering against the doorframe. The case files seemed to mock him from his desk, their manila folders innocuous yet damning. 2 young lives, bright with promise, now headed to prison. All because Whitmore wanted to send a message. All because Caldwell had played along like he always did, letting corruption wear the mask of justice. The twins' faces floated before him, their composed expressions, their matching sky-blue dresses, their quiet dignity. They hadn't screamed or protested when the verdict was read. They'd simply looked at him with those knowing eyes and offered forgiveness he didn't deserve. Their faith, unshaken even in the face of injustice, made his own moral compromise all the more stark. Later, lying in bed, sleep refused to come. The ceiling above him became a blank canvas for his troubled thoughts, shadows from passing cars dancing across its surface. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, Jasmine and Janelle watching him, waiting. Their forgiveness weighed heavier than any condemnation could have, a burden that pressed against his chest with each breath. The digital clock on Caldwell's nightstand blinked 2 a.m. when he jolted awake, his silk pajamas clinging to his sweat-soaked body. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and the expensive Egyptian cotton sheets were twisted around his legs, evidence of his restless sleep. The taste of fear lingered metallic on his tongue. In the darkness of his bedroom, fragments of the nightmare still clung to his consciousness, refusing to fade. The dream had felt so real, the weight of chains around his wrists, the creak of old wood beneath his feet as he stood in the defendant's box. But what haunted him most were their faces. Their eyes seemed to follow him even now, piercing through the darkness of his room. Jasmine and Janelle had sat in his place on the bench, their white dresses glowing with an otherworldly light, their expressions serene yet unyielding. They hadn't spoken a word, but their steady gaze had pierced through him, stripping away his carefully constructed facade of authority and righteousness. Their quiet dignity had been more damning than any angry outburst could have been. The jury foreman's voice still echoed in his mind. Guilty. One word that had sealed so many fates before, now turned against him. The slow descent of the noose from the shadowy ceiling had seemed to take forever, each inch bringing with it the weight of every wrongful conviction he'd ever handed down. He could still feel the rough hemp against his fingertips where he'd tried to push it away. And there was Whitmore, always Whitmore, his thin lips curved in that familiar smirk. "You should have listened," he had whispered, the words carrying across the dream courtroom like a death sentence. Even now, awake in his bedroom, Caldwell could feel the phantom pressure around his throat. His hand unconsciously rose to loosen a tie that wasn't there. His legs shaky, Caldwell pushed himself out of bed, leaving Margaret sleeping soundly beside him. Her gentle breathing seemed to mock the turmoil in his chest. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Atlanta's skyline. The city sprawled before him, a maze of twinkling lights and dark shadows. Somewhere out there, 2 innocent young women were spending their first night in jail because of him. The thought made bile rise in his throat. The cool glass against his forehead did little to calm his racing thoughts. His breath fogged the window, creating a small circle of opacity that seemed to mirror the cloudiness in his own conscience. The nightmare had stripped away his usual defenses, leaving him raw and exposed to the truth he'd been avoiding. Each heartbeat seemed to whisper their names. Jasmine. Janelle. Jasmine. Janelle. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen illuminating the dark room with its harsh glow. Caldwell's stomach twisted as he read the message from Whitmore. Forget about them. Sleep well. The words seemed to burn into his retinas, a digital brand of his guilt. A shiver ran down his spine and goosebumps raised on his arms. The message wasn't just a suggestion, it was a warning. Whitmore's tentacles reached everywhere, even into the sacred space of his bedroom, even into the private terror of his dreams. He could almost feel those invisible threads tightening around him, puppet strings he'd willingly accepted years ago. Standing there in the dark, Caldwell felt more alone than he ever had before. The city lights below seemed to mock him, each one a witness to his corruption, each shadow a reminder of the darkness he'd allowed into his life. The phone in his hand felt heavy with the weight of Whitmore's control, and the twins' faces from his dream seemed to hover in the darkness, watching, waiting, forgiving. Their grace was a judgment more severe than any punishment the law could devise. The morning sun streamed through the tall kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the marble countertops. Judge Theodore Caldwell sat at the breakfast table, his fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of black coffee. He lifted it to his lips, but the rich liquid tasted like nothing but ash in his mouth. Dark circles hung beneath his bloodshot eyes, testament to his sleepless night. His silk tie felt like a noose around his neck, choking him with every breath. Margaret sat across from him, her posture perfect as always. Her manicured fingers held the morning newspaper with practiced grace, but her eyes kept darting over the top of the pages to study her husband's haggard appearance. The silence between them felt heavy, broken only by the gentle rustle of paper and the occasional clink of china. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to mock their stilted breakfast routine. Rough night? Margaret's voice was cool, measured. When he didn't respond, she folded the newspaper with precise movements and placed it beside her untouched grapefruit. Her wedding ring caught the morning light, a reminder of promises made and broken. Caldwell stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Without a word, he grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, leaving his coffee barely touched. The weight of his guilt made even walking feel like wading through concrete. The courthouse loomed before him, its stone facade suddenly feeling more like a prison than a temple of justice. As he climbed the steps, two men in dark suits nodded at him, Whitmore's people. Their presence was a silent reminder of the invisible chains that bound him. His stomach churned. Their knowing smirks made his skin crawl as he hurried past. Inside his chambers, Caldwell closed the heavy oak door and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across his desk where the Carter twins' case file lay waiting. The familiar leather chair behind his desk, once a throne of authority, now felt like an electric chair. His hands trembled as he reached for the manila folder. Page after page of manufactured evidence, carefully constructed lies, all bearing his stamp of approval. The photos of Jasmine and Janelle stared back at him, their young faces full of hope and determination even as they sat in his courtroom. Their eyes seemed to follow him, piercing straight through to his corrupted soul. The truth he'd been fighting finally broke through his carefully constructed wall of denial. They were innocent. Completely, utterly innocent. And he had known it all along. The realization sat like poison in his gut, burning away what remained of his self-respect. His breath caught in his throat as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. He had sentenced two innocent girls to prison, not because justice demanded it, but because Daniel Whitmore had required it, because he had been too weak, too corrupted to stand against him. Every argument he'd used to justify his actions crumbled to dust. The case file trembled in his hands as he closed it. His heart pounded against his ribs, each beat a reminder of his cowardice. For the first time since this nightmare began, he allowed himself to ask the question that terrified him most. Can I fix this? The words echoed in his mind like a desperate prayer. The enormity of what he'd done, and what it would take to make it right, loomed before him like a mountain. The thought made his hands shake even harder. Somewhere in the building, another judge's gavel struck, the sound reverberating through the walls like the toll of a funeral bell. The soft glow of Caldwell's desk lamp cast long shadows across his office walls. Papers lay scattered across his mahogany desk, but his eyes were fixed on one document in particular, a motion for reconsideration. His hand trembled as he held the pen above the signature line, each second feeling like an eternity. Sweat beaded on his forehead as the enormity of the decision weighed upon him. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on his chest like a physical burden. To his right, a silver frame caught the lamplight. It held a photograph of him and Caroline at her high school graduation, both of them smiling, her arms wrapped around his neck. She had been so proud of him then. His daughter had believed in justice, in right and wrong. When had he stopped believing? When had he let the lines blur so completely? The pen hovered over the paper, a drop of ink forming at its tip, threatening to fall and stain the pristine document below. One signature could change everything. One signature could give those girls, Jasmine and Janelle, another chance at freedom. Their faces flashed in his mind, their quiet dignity, their words of forgiveness still echoing in his ears. The memory of their grace made his shame burn even hotter. The harsh ring of his desk phone shattered the silence like a gunshot. Caldwell's heart skipped a beat, his hand jerking away from the paper. He knew who it would be before he even reached for the receiver. His hand hesitated over the phone, but there was no ignoring it. Not in his world. Never in his world. "Hello?" His voice sounded weak, even to his own ears, barely more than a whisper. "I thought we had an understanding." Daniel Whitmore's voice slid through the line like oil on water, smooth but toxic. The familiar chill ran down Caldwell's spine, making him feel like a scared schoolboy all over again. He said nothing, his free hand clenching into a fist on the desk, nails digging crescents into his palm. "Let me be very clear," Whitmore continued, his tone dropping to something darker, something that promised pain. "If you reconsider their case, I'll make sure you don't live long enough to regret it." Each word fell like a hammer blow, methodical and crushing. Caldwell's fingers tightened around the phone until his knuckles turned white. Words of defiance built up in his throat, years of suppressed anger and shame threatening to burst forth. But they died on his tongue, turning to ash in his mouth. He knew better. He'd always known better. That's what made it worse. A heavy sigh came through the line, filled with false patience. "You're not stupid, Caldwell. Keep playing your role." The words carried the weight of chains. The phone slipped from Caldwell's grip, landing with a dull thud on his desk. His eyes moved back to the motion for reconsideration, the blank signature line mocking him with its emptiness. His hand remained frozen above the paper, the pen growing heavier with each passing second, like it was made of lead instead of plastic. He couldn't sign it. Not yet. The price was too high, the consequences too severe. The motion lay there, unsigned, a testament to his continued cowardice. In the dim light, his reflection in the desk's polished surface showed him exactly what he'd become, a man trapped by his own choices. The afternoon sun filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across Judge Caldwell's office. His untouched coffee had gone cold hours ago, the dark liquid reflecting his troubled expression, and his stomach growled in protest of another missed meal. But food was the last thing on his mind. Those words, "We forgive you," kept echoing in his head like a haunting melody he couldn't shake, tormenting him with their unexpected grace. A knock at the door made him straighten his posture instinctively, his shoulders tensing beneath his wrinkled suit jacket. He cleared his throat, expecting his assistant with another stack of files. "Come in." Instead, Caroline walked in, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor like a metronome counting down his sins. Her presence, usually a source of comfort, now felt like an accusation. She wore a navy blue blazer that matched her determined expression and carried herself with the same authority he'd always admired, and tried to instill in her since she was old enough to toddle around his courthouse. "I had to hear about you from the news?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air of his office like a blade through silk. Caldwell sighed, rubbing his forehead where a headache had been building all day, pulsing with each guilty thought. "Caroline, this isn't a good time." She moved closer, her eyes scanning the mess of papers scattered across his usually immaculate desk. Legal documents, case files, and newspaper clippings created a chaotic landscape of guilt and indecision, each page a testament to his corruption. "What are you doing?" His hands instinctively moved to cover some of the papers, fingers trembling slightly against the damning evidence. The motion wasn't lost on Caroline, whose eyes narrowed with the same scrutiny he'd taught her to use in her own legal career. Whitmore's threat rang in his ears. If he talked, if he revealed anything, it wouldn't just be his life at stake anymore. He couldn't risk Caroline becoming a target of that monster's revenge. "Dad, what did you do?" Her voice softened, but the question hit him like a physical blow, forcing him deeper into his leather chair. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths and shattered ideals. Caroline's jaw tightened as she watched her father, the man who'd taught her about justice and integrity, refuse to meet her eyes. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away precious seconds, each moment widening the gulf between them. She slammed her hands down on the desk, making the coffee cup rattle against its saucer. "Tell me I'm wrong." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the hurt beneath her anger. "Tell me you didn't send two innocent girls to prison." Caldwell's throat constricted, dry as sandpaper. He wanted to explain, to tell her everything, about Whitmore's threats, about the corruption that had slowly poisoned his soul like a cancer, about the twins' forgiveness that now haunted his every waking moment. But the words wouldn't come. He remained silent, and in that silence, he watched something break in his daughter's eyes, something precious and irreplaceable. Caroline straightened up, her movements stiff as she gripped her purse with white-knuckled fingers. The disappointment in her face was worse than any judgment he'd ever faced in his courtroom. She paused at the door, turning back one last time, her silhouette framed by the hall light. "You don't look like my father anymore," she whispered, each word landing like a verdict in a death penalty case. Then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a quiet click that felt more final than any slam could have. Caldwell sat alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his shame, the afternoon shadows growing longer around him like accusing fingers pointing at his guilt. The city lights twinkled like distant stars through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Caldwell's study. He paced back and forth, his expensive leather shoes pressing into the plush carpet with each heavy step. The crystal tumbler in his hand caught the dim light as he raised it to his lips, letting the scotch burn down his throat. It wasn't enough. Nothing was enough to quiet the storm in his mind. His reflection in the window looked haunted, dark circles under his eyes, tie loosened and crooked, hair disheveled from running his fingers through it countless times. The man staring back at him was a stranger. Caroline's words echoed in his mind. "You don't look like my father anymore." She was right. Whitmore's threat rang in his ears. "If you reconsider their case, I'll make sure you don't live long enough to regret it." And through it all he could see Jasmine and Janelle's faces, their quiet dignity, as they were led away in handcuffs. The soft swish of silk against the doorframe made him turn. Margaret stood there, wrapped in her cream-colored robe, a glass of red wine dangling from her manicured fingers. Her face was a mask of contempt. "You're weak," she muttered, taking a slow sip of wine. The words dripped with disdain. Caldwell's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He turned back to the window, trying to ignore her presence. But Margaret wasn't finished. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she approached, each step deliberate and threatening. "You had everything," she hissed, standing close enough that he could smell her expensive perfume. "Power, respect, influence, everything we worked for years to build." She let out a bitter laugh. "And now you're going to throw it all away because of what? A guilty conscience?" Caldwell's grip tightened on his glass, his knuckles turning white. The crystal creaked under the pressure. "If you go down," Margaret continued, her voice ice-cold, "don't expect me to go down with you." She paused, letting the threat sink in. "I won't stand by and watch you destroy everything we've built because you've suddenly developed a moral compass." The scotch in his glass trembled with the force of his grip. He could feel the crystal straining, nearly at its breaking point, just like him. Margaret turned away, her silk robe whispering across the floor. She paused at the doorway, looking back over her shoulder. "You were never this weak before. It's pathetic." Caldwell stared out at the city lights, his reflection fractured in the windowpane. The words came out barely above a whisper. "Then maybe weakness is what I need." For the first time since the trial, since Whitmore's threats, since Caroline's disappointment, something shifted inside him. His shoulders straightened slightly, even as the weight of his choices pressed down on him. The streetlights cast long shadows across Caldwell's face as he guided his Mercedes through Atlanta's empty streets. His knuckles were white against the black leather of the steering wheel, tension radiating through every finger. The city felt different at night, quieter, more honest somehow. Like the masks everyone wore during the day had finally slipped away, revealing the raw truth beneath the polished facade. "No turning back now," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the soft purr of the engine. The words hung heavy in the air-conditioned cabin. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade eerily pale in the moonlight, columns stretching upward like ancient guardians. Caldwell pulled into the judge's private parking area, his heart thundering against his ribs. He sat for a moment, key in the ignition gathering his courage. The weight of his security badge felt heavy in his pocket, a constant reminder of everything he stood to lose. The side entrance opened with a soft click that seemed to echo in the stillness. Inside, the courthouse was a maze of shadows and silence, the familiar marble floors now strange and forbidding. His footsteps echoed despite his attempt to walk quietly, each sound making him wince. The familiar halls felt foreign in the darkness, like walking through a dream where nothing was quite as it should be. The records room was tucked away in the basement, protected by both a keycard lock and a regular key. As head judge, Caldwell had access to both, though he'd never imagined using them like this. His hands trembled slightly as he unlocked the door, the metal cool against his sweating palms. The smell of old paper and dust greeted him, thick and musty. Row after row of metal filing cabinets stretched into the darkness like silent sentinels. Caldwell pulled out his phone, using its flashlight to guide him through the labels, the beam dancing across decades of legal history. His breath came in short, sharp bursts, the sound unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Carter, Carter," he muttered, scanning the files, fingers brushing past countless names. Finally, he found it. A thick manila folder marked Carter, Jasmine, and Janelle. The folder felt heavier than it should, weighted down with guilt and secrets. The pages inside told the real story, each document another nail in the coffin of justice. Police reports with obvious inconsistencies, hastily covered up. Witness statements that contradicted each other, clearly coached. Evidence logs that didn't match the trial exhibits, altered with practiced precision. Most damning of all, a handwritten note from one of Whitmore's associates discussing how to handle the evidence. The casual corruption spelled out in flowing blue ink. Caldwell's hands shook as he held up his phone, ready to photograph each damning page. The truth was right here, in black and white, waiting to be exposed. His finger hovered over the camera button. A sound made him freeze. Footsteps coming closer, steady and purposeful. The beam of a flashlight swept across the floor near the door, yellow light creeping under the threshold. Caldwell's heart stopped. He tried to slide the folder back, fumbling in panic, but it was too late. The metal drawer rattled accusingly in the silence. The security guard's flashlight found him, caught like a deer in headlights with the incriminating folder in his hands. Time seemed to stop as their eyes met across the darkness. The next morning's headlines screamed across every local news outlet. Judge Caldwell under investigation for bribery. Somehow, Whitmore had outmaneuvered him again, turning Caldwell's attempt at redemption into his own downfall. The morning papers fluttered in the breeze, each one carrying the story of his disgrace. Caldwell jerked awake to the aggressive buzzing of his phone. His head felt heavy, his mouth dry from a restless night filled with fragments of guilty dreams. The device skittered across the polished wood of his nightstand like an angry insect, the screen lighting up with missed calls from numbers he didn't recognize. Before he could grab it, the doorbell's harsh chime cut through the morning silence, followed by thunderous knocking that made his windows rattle and his heart race. Stumbling out of bed, still in his wrinkled dress shirt and slacks from yesterday, the fabric creased and damp with nervous sweat, he made his way to the front door. His bare feet felt cold against the hardwood floors, each step a reminder of how exposed he felt. When he swung the door open, no one was there, just a thick stack of newspapers scattered across his welcome mat like fallen leaves. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution's bold headline punched him in the gut. Corrupt judge taking bribes? Investigation underway. The black letters seemed to grow larger as he stared at them, accusing him with their stark clarity. His hands trembled as he snatched up the paper, nearly tearing the pages in his haste. The morning sun felt too bright, too exposing, as if nature itself wanted to shine a spotlight on his shame. The article was brutal, detailing anonymous sources who claimed he'd been accepting bribes for years. His photo, taken during happier times at a charity gala, stared back at him accusingly from above the fold, his confident smile now seeming more like a smirk. Racing to his car, he barely registered the drive to the courthouse, running 3 red lights and nearly sideswiping a delivery truck. The familiar building that had been his second home for decades now felt like enemy territory, its grand columns no longer proud but menacing. As he walked through the marble halls, the usual morning bustle died down to whispers. Staff members who normally greeted him warmly now found sudden interest in their phones or paperwork, their bodies turning away as he passed. "Good morning, Judge Caldwell," his assistant Rebecca Monroe said, her voice tight and formal, like a rubber band about to snap. She wouldn't meet his eyes, focusing instead on reorganizing papers that were already perfectly arranged, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm sorry, but the chief judge won't see you. He's, unavailable." The pause before "unavailable" spoke volumes. Caldwell nodded stiffly, trying to maintain what dignity he had left, though he felt it crumbling like sand. "I see. Thank you, Rebecca." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. The walk to his chambers felt like a mile, each footstep echoing off the walls like a countdown. Every step echoed with judgment. Young clerks who used to hang on his every word now pressed themselves against the walls to avoid him, as if his fall from grace might be contagious. The whispers followed him like shadows, growing louder in his mind with each passing second. When he reached his office, he stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. The brass nameplate that had adorned his door for 20 years, "The Honorable Theodore Caldwell," was gone, leaving only faint marks on the dark wood like scars. The sight hit him harder than the newspaper headlines, making his chest tighten painfully. Inside his office, everything looked the same but felt different, like walking into a perfect replica of a familiar room. His law books, his certificates, his family photos, they all seemed to mock him now. Testimonies to a legacy he'd corrupted. As he closed the door behind him, he heard his secretary's whispered words clear as a bell. "I thought you were different." The words settled over him like a heavy blanket, reminding him of other disappointed voices, Caroline's, Eleanor Carter's, and most haunting of all, the twins' quiet, "We forgive you." Now he understood the true weight of forgiveness. It wasn't absolution, but a challenge to be better, a burden heavier than any sentence he'd ever handed down from his bench. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Caldwell's silver Mercedes crept past the Atlanta courthouse. His hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel, knuckles white from gripping too hard, sweat beading on his temples. The building that had once been his sanctuary now loomed like an accusatory finger pointing at the sky, its granite facade cold and unforgiving in the harsh light. A sea of angry faces filled the courthouse steps. Dozens of protesters waved handmade signs, their messages clear and cutting. "Caldwell equals corruption. Justice for Jasmine and Janelle." Some carried photos of the twins in their graduation gowns, smiling with hope that had been crushed by his gavel. Others clutched Bibles and prayer beads, their lips moving in silent supplication for justice. His stomach churned violently. These were the same people who used to nod respectfully as he passed, who had trusted him to uphold justice. Now their eyes burned with hatred and disgust, years of respect transformed into bitter disappointment. Trying to remain inconspicuous, Caldwell parked his car around the corner, in the shadow of an old oak tree. He adjusted his tie with shaking fingers, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm his nerves, and stepped out of the vehicle. The sound of something wet hitting his windshield made him jump. A ripe tomato slid down the glass, leaving a trail of red pulp that looked like blood, a stark reminder of his sins. "There he is," someone shouted. The crowd turned like a single organism, their anger finding its target. The air crackled with tension and barely contained fury. A middle-aged woman with graying hair pointed at him, her face lined with grief and anger. "You ruined those girls' lives." Her voice cracked with emotion, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Others joined in, their voices rising in a chorus of condemnation, the sound echoing off the courthouse walls. "Shame on you. How much did they pay you? Those girls trusted you." Caldwell tried to push forward, keeping his head down, his expensive suit offering no protection against their verbal assault. The crowd pressed closer, their signs waving like weapons, the air thick with tension. Someone threw a water bottle that missed his head by inches, the plastic clattering against the pavement. The hatred in their eyes was overwhelming. He saw parents who imagined their own children in Jasmine and Janelle's place, citizens whose faith in justice he had betrayed, their faces contorted with righteous anger. Security guards in blue uniforms burst through the courthouse doors, creating a human barrier between Caldwell and the protesters. They rushed him inside, their hands firm on his shoulders, their faces professionally blank but their grip unnecessarily rough. The heavy doors shut behind them with a resounding thud, muffling the angry chants, but couldn't silence the shame roaring in his ears like a hurricane. Inside his chambers, Caldwell collapsed into his leather chair, the familiar comfort now feeling like a mockery. His heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to escape. Sweat darkened the collar of his expensive shirt and trickled down his back. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from Whitmore lit up the screen. "Still think you can win?" The words seemed to glow with malicious intent. The words made his mouth go dry, terror creeping up his spine. Whitmore was watching, always watching, probably enjoying every second of his public humiliation from some comfortable, air-conditioned office. When it was time to leave, Caldwell waited until security cleared a path through the diminished but still angry crowd, their faces set in stone. He hurried to his car, head down, trying to block out the jeers and insults that followed him like vengeful spirits. Just as he reached for the door handle, a sharp knock on his window made him flinch, his keys almost falling from his trembling hands. A reporter thrust a microphone toward the glass, her red lipstick curved in a predatory smile, camera lights blazing behind her. "Any comment on your fall from grace, Your Honor?" Caldwell's only response was the roar of his engine as he peeled away from the curb, tires squealing in protest, leaving behind the ruins of his reputation and the echoes of justice denied. In his rearview mirror, the courthouse diminished but seemed to watch him go, a silent witness to his shame. Caldwell's hand trembled as he pushed open the heavy oak door of his mansion. His shoulders sagged from the weight of the day's humiliation. All he wanted was a stiff drink and the familiar sight of Margaret in the kitchen, nursing her evening wine, the way she had every night for the past 23 years. The entryway lights were already on, casting harsh shadows across the marble floor. Margaret stood there, perfectly composed in her designer suit, surrounded by 3 expensive leather suitcases. Her face was a mask of cold determination, devoid of the warmth he'd once known. His throat went dry, his heart stumbling in his chest. "What's this?" Margaret crossed her arms, her wedding ring catching the light with a mocking glimmer. "What does it look like, Theodore?" "I'm leaving." "Margaret, we can talk about this." His voice cracked, betraying the panic rising in his chest. "You ruined everything," she spat, her perfectly painted lips curling with disgust. "Everything we built, our reputation, our life, the respect we commanded in this city." He took a step toward her, desperation creeping into his voice, his hands outstretched. "Margaret, please." "Don't beg." Her words cut like ice, each syllable precise and devastating. "It's pathetic. You're not the man I married." She pulled out her phone, manicured nail tapping the screen as she showed him their joint bank account. 0 balance. "I took care of myself this morning, you understand, of course." The blood drained from his face, leaving him lightheaded. Their savings, their investments, all gone. She'd stripped him bare while he was facing the angry mob at the courthouse, their accusations still ringing in his ears. Margaret's smirk was cruel, an expression he'd never seen on her face before. "You'll survive. You always do." She grabbed the handle of her largest suitcase, the wheels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown. At the door she paused, looking back over her shoulder, her pearl earrings gleaming. "One more thing. If you overturn that case, you'll be dead in a week." The words hit him like a physical blow, making him stagger back. Understanding dawned, bitter and sharp as broken glass. "You knew," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "About Whitmore, about everything." "Of course I knew." Her laugh was hollow, echoing off the high ceilings. "Who do you think suggested your name to him in the first place?" The revelation knocked the air from his lungs, leaving him gasping like a drowning man. All these years he'd thought he was protecting her from the truth, shielding her from the darkness of his decisions. Instead, she'd been deeper in it than him, orchestrating his fall from the very beginning. Margaret lifted her chin, regarding him like something stuck to the bottom of her shoe. Her eyes, once warm brown, now seemed as cold as frozen earth. "Goodbye, Theodore. Try not to die too quickly." The door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. Caldwell stood frozen in his empty foyer, surrounded by evidence of her swift departure. Empty closets visible through open doors, bare spots on walls where her favorite paintings had hung, the faint outline of frames visible in the dust. The silence pressed in around him, deafening in its totality. He was truly alone now, stripped of everything. His reputation, his money, and the woman he'd thought would stand beside him through anything. The realization settled over him like a burial shroud, heavy and final. The hollow echo of knocking pierced the Sunday morning silence. Caldwell lifted his head from where he'd fallen asleep in his leather armchair, his neck stiff and his mouth dry from too much whiskey. Empty bottles littered the coffee table, testament to his sleepless night. The morning sun streaming through the windows made his head pound mercilessly. His heart jumped at the sound. Maybe Margaret had changed her mind. Maybe she'd come back. He straightened his rumpled shirt and ran a hand through his disheveled hair as he made his way to the door, trying to ignore the way the room spun slightly with each step. But when he opened it, Caroline stood there instead. Her green eyes, so much like his own, were hard as stone. In her trembling hands, she clutched today's newspaper, her knuckles white against the black headlines. The familiar scent of her lavender perfume, usually so comforting, now made his stomach turn. "Did you do it?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through him like a knife. The morning breeze ruffled her dark hair, so like her mother's. Caldwell's throat went dry. He knew exactly what she was asking. The question he'd been dreading since this all began. His silence stretched between them like a chasm, heavy with unspoken guilt. "Dad," her voice cracked. "Please tell me you didn't know. Tell me you didn't send those girls to prison knowing they were innocent." Her bottom lip quivered, just like it had when she was a little girl coming to him with scraped knees. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? How could he explain the years of compromise, of looking the other way, of telling himself it was for the greater good? The weight of his choices pressed down on his chest like a stone. "Oh my God." Caroline's face drained of color as understanding dawned. "Oh my God." She took a step back, shaking her head, her earrings catching the morning light. "You knew? You actually knew they were innocent and you let them go to prison anyway." "Caroline, please." He reached for her arm, his fingers trembling. "Let me explain. There are things you don't understand." "Don't touch me." She jerked away from him as if his touch burned. "Don't you dare try to explain this away. Those girls are my age, Dad. They had their whole lives ahead of them. Their mother visits them every weekend. Did you know that? She takes 2 buses to get there." "I had no choice," he pleaded. "Whitmore?" The crack of her palm against his cheek silenced him. The sting spread across his face as he stared at his daughter in shock. She'd never struck him before, never looked at him with such disgust. The newspaper fell from her hands, scattering across the doorstep. "You're worse than a coward," she hissed, tears gathering in her eyes, mascara beginning to run. "You're a monster. All those years I looked up to you, defended you when people said you were corrupt. I thought you stood for justice. I thought you were the man who taught me right from wrong." Each word felt like another slap. Caldwell wanted to grab her, shake her, make her understand the impossible position he'd been in. But he couldn't move. His limbs felt weighted with lead and shame. Caroline backed away toward the door, her shoulders shaking. "You know what the worst part is? Those girls forgave you. They showed more strength in that moment than you've shown in your entire life. They're better people than you'll ever be." She reached for the doorknob, pausing one last time. Over her shoulder, she whispered words that shattered what was left of his heart. "I have no father." The door slammed shut with finality, leaving Caldwell alone in his empty house. His legs gave out beneath him, and for the first time since he was a child, he sank to his knees on the cold hardwood floor. The weight of everything, his choices, his cowardice, his shame, finally broke him completely. Outside, a car engine started, and he listened as his daughter drove away, taking the last remnants of his self-respect with her. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away, its sound unnaturally loud in the empty house. Caldwell sat motionless in his darkened living room, an untouched glass of scotch growing warm in his trembling hand. The silence pressed in on him from all sides. No clicking of Margaret's heels on hardwood floors. No gentle humming from the kitchen where she used to stand with her wine. No soft laughter from family dinners that now felt like memories from another lifetime. Just emptiness. The sudden pounding at his front door made him jump, splashing scotch onto his wrinkled shirt. A dark stain spread across the once pristine fabric, matching the others from days of neglect. His heart hammered against his ribs as he set down the glass, the crystal making a hollow sound against the table. At this hour, it could only mean trouble. When he opened the door, Daniel Whitmore stood there like a perfectly carved statue, his navy suit crisp despite the late hour, not a silver hair out of place. His face was a mask of polite indifference, but his eyes glittered with something cold and predatory, like a snake sizing up its prey. The porch light cast harsh shadows across his features, making him look even more menacing. Without waiting for an invitation, Whitmore stepped inside, his expensive shoes clicking against the floor as he surveyed the room. Empty bottles scattered across tables, newspapers strewn about, dishes piled in the sink visible through the kitchen doorway. Evidence of Caldwell's spiral into despair. Whitmore's lips curled into a slight smirk as he picked up the nearest paper, scanning the headlines about Caldwell's corruption scandal, his manicured fingers leaving creases in the newsprint. "You had everything," Whitmore said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with venom. Power, status, respect. He let the paper fall back onto the coffee table with a soft rustle. "And now, you want to throw it all away over two little girls who don't matter? After everything we've built together?" Caldwell's hands curled into fists at his sides, fingernails digging into his palms. "They didn't deserve this. None of this was right. Neither did you." Whitmore stepped closer, invading Caldwell's space. His cologne, expensive and overwhelming, filled the air between them like a suffocating cloud. "But you made your choice, Caldwell. You chose to play this game with me years ago." He straightened his already perfect tie, the silk catching the dim light. "So let me make mine clear. You're going to drop this madness. You're going to disappear quietly, for old time's sake." Something snapped inside Caldwell. After losing everything, his wife, his daughter, his reputation, his self-respect, what more could this man take? "Or what?" he spat back, surprising himself with his own defiance. The change in Whitmore was instant. His carefully maintained smile vanished, replaced by something dark and dangerous that transformed his entire face. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper, each word sharp as a blade. "You'll be dead before the week is over, and no one will even question it." The threat hung in the air like poison gas, thick and suffocating. Whitmore held Caldwell's gaze for a long moment, then calmly adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the light. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, his movements deliberate and controlled like a predator confident in its kill. Caldwell's hands shook violently as he locked the door behind Whitmore, checking it twice. He leaned against it, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe, cold sweat beading on his forehead. For the first time since this nightmare began, he truly feared for his life. The grandfather clock continued its relentless ticking, counting down minutes he might not have left. The grandfather clock struck 3, its deep chimes echoing through the empty house like a funeral bell. Caldwell sat at his mahogany desk, the resignation letter stark white against the dark wood, its crisp edges catching the light. The antique brass lamp cast yellow shadows across the carefully typed words. His ticket to safety, his path to survival, his final surrender to corruption. His hands trembled as he held the paper, sweat making the edges curl slightly. The letterhead of the Atlanta Superior Court seemed to mock him, each official serif reminding him of everything he'd built and lost. One signature, just a few strokes of ink, and it would all go away. Whitmore would let him live. He could disappear to some quiet town, become nobody, spend his days looking over his shoulder. The faces of Jasmine and Janelle flashed in his mind, haunting him. Their composed dignity in court, heads held high despite everything. Their matching blue dresses, pressed and proper, chosen with care for justice that never came. Now they wore prison orange, separated from their mother, their futures stolen by his weakness. Because of him, because he'd been a coward when it mattered most. Margaret's words echoed in his head sharp as the day she'd spoken them. "You're not the man I married." Caroline's voice joined in, thick with disgust. "I have no father." The headlines screamed across his memory like accusations. Corrupt judge taking bribes? Each word had been another nail in his coffin. He was already ruined, stripped of everything that had once defined him. His wife had abandoned him, taking their money and leaving only silence. His daughter despised him, wouldn't even take his calls. His reputation lay in tatters, whispers following him through courthouse corridors. The thought hit him like a physical blow, making him flinch. What was left to lose? What else could they take? Caldwell looked at the resignation letter again, really looked at it, seeing it for what it truly was. This piece of paper represented everything weak about him, every moral compromise, every rationalization. Every time he'd looked the other way, telling himself it was for the greater good. Every case he'd fixed for Whitmore, each one a brick in the wall of his prison. Every lie he'd told himself about maintaining order, about necessary evils. His hands stopped shaking, steadied by sudden clarity. With deliberate slowness, he gripped the edges of the paper, feeling its expensive weight. The sound of tearing filled the room like liberation as he ripped it cleanly in half. Then again, and again, until the pieces scattered across his desk like snow, like the fragments of his old life falling away. Something shifted inside him, broke loose and reformed. The fear was still there, cold in his gut, but now it sat alongside something else. Determination, purpose, maybe even the first stirrings of courage. He wouldn't run. Not anymore. Not from this. Caldwell reached for his laptop, opening it with steady hands, purpose replacing hesitation. The screen's blue light illuminated his face as he created a new document, casting harsh shadows that seemed to age him decades. He titled it simply, Evidence. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling now not with fear but with anticipation. He knew where all the bodies were buried, every dirty secret. Every case Whitmore had corrupted with his money and influence. Every judge he'd bought with promises and threats. Every witness he'd threatened into silence. And most importantly, every piece of evidence that would prove Jasmine and Janelle's innocence, that would set right at least one of his many wrongs. It was time to write it all down. Time to finally tell the truth, whatever the cost. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Caldwell parked his weathered sedan a block away. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the worn baseball cap, pulling the brim low over his eyes. The familiar weight of his judge's robe was missing, replaced by a plain gray sweater and jeans, clothes meant to help him blend in with the steady stream of people heading to work. Through the rearview mirror, he scanned the street carefully, his practiced eyes searching for any sign of surveillance. No black sedans, no men in suits, no suspicious vehicles idling at corners. His heart thudded against his ribs as he stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sound of passing traffic doing little to calm his nerves. The courthouse felt different now, alien and hostile. The marble floors that once echoed with his confident footsteps now seemed to whisper accusations with every step. Staff members who used to greet him warmly hurried past, averting their eyes or whispering behind raised hands. He kept his head down, shoulders hunched, moving quickly toward the records room like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. The musty smell of old paper files hit him as he pushed open the heavy door, the hinges creaking softly. Only one clerk sat at the far desk, absorbed in paperwork, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. Perfect. Caldwell moved swiftly to the sealed cases section, his fingers dancing across the file tabs until he found what he needed. Muscle memory from years on the bench guiding his search. The Carter twins' case file was thick with documents, bulging with the weight of injustice. His hands shook as he began pulling out paper after paper, each one a piece of the puzzle he'd helped construct. There it was. The original police report, showing no evidence linking the twins to the crime. Next came the witness statements that had mysteriously disappeared before trial, their testimony contradicting the prosecution's narrative. Then the lab results that had been altered, the original findings buried beneath layers of fabrication. Each document told the same story, a carefully orchestrated frame job, planned with surgical precision. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he began photographing everything, trying to keep the pages from rustling too loudly in the tomb-like silence. Click after click, he captured the truth he had helped bury, each image a step toward redemption or destruction. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down his temples. The weight of what he was doing pressed down on him like a physical force. These documents proved not just the twins' innocence, but his own guilt, his own corruption. Every photo was another nail in his own coffin, and he was holding the hammer. But he kept going, driven by a desperate need to make things right. Click. The fabricated evidence that had sealed the twins' fate. Click. The falsified testimonies that had convinced the jury. Click. The paper trail leading straight to Whitmore's interference, each document a thread in the web of corruption. His finger trembled over the screen as he verified each image was clear and readable, knowing there would be no second chances. The quiet of the records room suddenly felt oppressive, like the air itself was watching. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, his instincts screaming danger. He could feel it, eyes watching, recording his every move. Someone knew he was here. Someone would tell Whitmore. It was only a matter of time. Carefully, he returned each document to its proper place, making sure the file looked untouched, erasing any trace of his presence. His phone felt like it was burning in his pocket now, heavy with its damning evidence. As he stepped out of the records room, the weight of unseen eyes followed him, and the corridors seemed to stretch endlessly before him, each step taking him closer to either salvation or destruction. The soft glow of Caldwell's desk lamp illuminated the scattered photos before him, casting long shadows across his worn face. His fingers traced over the damning evidence, doctored police reports, fabricated witness statements, all proof of the twins' innocence. Stacks of manila folders threatened to topple from his desk's edge. The house was silent except for the gentle hum of his computer and the occasional rustle of paper as he organized the documents, each one another nail in Whitmore's coffin. "This will bury you, Whitmore," he muttered, arranging the photos in order, a grim satisfaction settling in his chest. The loud crack came without warning, shattering the quiet night. Glass exploded inward, showering his desk with crystalline shards that sparkled like deadly diamonds in the lamplight. Caldwell's body reacted before his mind could process what was happening, throwing himself sideways as another shot rang out. Wood splintered from the bookshelf where his head had been moments before, sending splinters and dust raining down. His heart hammered against his ribs as he crawled across the floor, pressing himself flat against the wall beside the doorway. Sweat beaded on his forehead as books tumbled from the shelves, thudding around him like a literary rainfall. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, burning his nostrils. Tires screeched outside, rubber burning against asphalt, the sound growing distant as the attackers fled into the night. Caldwell remained frozen, barely breathing, counting the seconds in his head. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Only when 3 full minutes had passed did he dare to move, his joints creaking in protest. Standing on shaky legs, he surveyed the damage, his stomach churning at the scene before him. The window was completely shattered, cool night air rushing in through the jagged opening, stirring loose papers into a frenzied dance. Documents were scattered everywhere, glass glittering among them in the dim light like cruel confetti. His eyes fixed on his heavy wooden desk, where a bullet had buried itself deep into the mahogany surface, right where he had been sitting moments ago. The sight made his blood run cold. The message was clear. This was his final warning. Whitmore wasn't playing games anymore. Caldwell's hands trembled as he reached for his phone, but his voice was steady as he dialed the number he'd memorized earlier that day. It rang twice before a woman answered, her voice crisp and professional. "Sarah Chen, Atlanta Tribune?" "Ms. Chen?" Caldwell said, his eyes fixed on the bullet hole in his desk, resolve hardening in his chest. "I have a story for you, one that's going to change everything." The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Judge Theodore Caldwell approached the makeshift podium, his footsteps echoing solemnly. His hands trembled slightly, but his jaw was set with an unwavering determination that belied the turmoil raging within. Dark circles under his eyes betrayed the sleepless night he had endured, and his usually pristine suit looked rumpled, as if he had hastily thrown it on without a care for his appearance. Dozens of reporters jostled for position, their cameras clicking rapidly, microphones pointed at him like accusing fingers. The air felt electric with anticipation, the crowd buzzing with a palpable sense of unease, as if they could sense the gravity of Caldwell's impending confession. Caldwell gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles turning white from the intensity of his grasp. The familiar faces of local news anchors stared back at him, their eyes narrowed with suspicion, waiting with bated breath. He had stood before crowds countless times before, his commanding presence and judicial authority always commanding respect, but never like this. Never to confess his own misdeeds, his own betrayal of the very system he had sworn to uphold. "I dot." His voice cracked, betraying the weight of his words. He cleared his throat and started again, his tone now resolute, unwavering. "I lied." The simple words seemed to echo across the courthouse steps, reverberating in the stunned silence that followed. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd, like the distant rumble of thunder before a storm. Camera flashes intensified, capturing the moment of his admission. "I knowingly sentenced 2 innocent young women to prison." His voice grew stronger with each word, the burden of his guilt now spilling forth. Jasmine and Janelle Carter were framed. The evidence was fabricated. The witnesses were pressured. The entire case was orchestrated by Daniel Whitmore. The crowd erupted, a cacophony of shock and outrage as reporters shouted questions all at once, their voices overlapping in a desperate attempt to uncover the truth. Caldwell raised his hand, commanding silence, his eyes steely with determination. "For years I've been part of a corrupt system. I accepted bribes. I manipulated evidence. I destroyed lives." His voice shook with emotion, the weight of his confession palpable. "I did it for power, for money, for status, and I was wrong." At the back of the crowd, Whitmore stood perfectly still, his face a mask of cold fury. Their eyes met briefly across the sea of reporters, a silent exchange of mutual understanding and unspoken threat. "I have documentation," Caldwell continued, pulling out a thick manila envelope. "Proof of every case that was tampered with, every bribe that was paid, every innocent person who suffered because of our corruption." The reporters surged forward, hands reaching for the envelope, their curiosity and desperation to uncover the truth overwhelming. Camera crews pushed closer, their lenses focused intently on his face, capturing every nuance of his expression. "The Carter twins weren't the first victims of this system, but I'm making sure they'll be the last." Caldwell's voice carried across the crowd, resolute and unwavering. "I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions, but I won't stay silent anymore." Questions flew at him from every direction, a barrage of inquiries that sought to unravel the layers of his betrayal. Through the chaos, a single reporter's voice cut through, the question hanging in the air like a challenge. "Judge Caldwell, do you regret it?" He stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable, as security guards began clearing a path through the frenzied crowd. The weight of his actions and the uncertainty of his future etched upon his weathered features. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the small interrogation room, casting harsh shadows across Judge Theodore Caldwell's face. His shoulders felt heavy under his wrinkled suit jacket as he sat perfectly still, hands folded on the cold metal table. The room seemed to shrink with each passing minute, the bare walls closing in like a trap he'd walked into willingly. The door's hinges creaked, breaking the silence. 2 FBI agents entered. Agent Sarah Martinez, sharp-eyed and businesslike in her dark pantsuit, and Agent James Cooper, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and deep frown lines. "Judge Caldwell," Martinez said, taking the seat across from him. Cooper remained standing, arms crossed. "We understand you have something for us." Caldwell nodded slowly, reaching into his briefcase. His fingers brushed against the manila folders, evidence he'd gathered at great risk. He placed them on the table, sliding them toward Martinez. "Everything's here," he said, his voice hoarse. "Police reports that were altered, witness statements that disappeared, bank records showing Whitmore's payments. His hand lingered on the folders before letting go. It's all there. Martinez opened the first file, her eyes scanning the documents. Cooper leaned over her shoulder, his frown deepening as he read. "Jesus," Cooper muttered, picking up a particular document. This report was completely fabricated. The original witness statement. He shook his head. "This is enough to arrest half the department." Martinez looked up from the files, her expression hard to read. The twins' case wasn't the only one, was it? No, Caldwell admitted. Whitmore had his fingers in dozens of cases. Always the same pattern. Evidence disappeared. Witnesses changed their stories. Verdicts went his way. Cooper pulled out a chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. He sat down, leaning forward. "But what about you, Judge Caldwell?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Caldwell's stomach twisted painfully. He'd known this moment was coming from the second he'd decided to confess. "I took bribes," he said quietly. "I helped bury evidence. I sentenced innocent people." His voice cracked slightly. "I became everything a judge shouldn't be." Martinez gathered the files carefully, tapping them into a neat stack. "This evidence will help free the Carter twins. It might even bring down Whitmore's entire operation." "But," Caldwell prompted, already knowing the answer. "But it also proves your involvement in multiple felonies," Cooper finished. "Judicial misconduct, accepting bribes, conspiracy to obstruct justice." Caldwell nodded slowly. The weight of his crimes pressed down on him like a physical force. The twins would be free, but he was about to lose everything. His freedom, his reputation, what remained of his family's respect. As the agent stood to leave, Martinez paused at the door. "We'll need you to stay available for questioning." The door closed behind them with a heavy click. Caldwell rested his head in his hands, feeling the full impact of what he'd just done. The room felt even smaller now, a preview of the cell that likely waited in his future. His confession would free Jasmine and Janelle from their unjust imprisonment, but there would be no such freedom for him. The truth had finally broken free, and now it would break him too. The small TV in Caldwell's office crackled with static before the breaking news alert flashed across the screen. His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips as bold letters appeared. "Daniel Whitmore arrested in federal sting operation." The news anchor's voice filled the empty office. In a stunning development this afternoon, prominent businessman Daniel Whitmore was taken into custody by federal agents. Sources say the arrest is connected to widespread corruption in Atlanta's judicial system. Caldwell set down his cup with trembling hands. Live helicopter footage showed Whitmore's sprawling mansion surrounded by black FBI vehicles. Agents in dark jackets swarmed the property like ants. Then came the moment. Whitmore, still in his expensive suit, being led out in handcuffs. His usual smirk was gone, replaced by barely contained rage. "Additional arrests are being made across the city," the anchor continued. The screen split to show multiple locations. Judge Harrison, arrested while leaving lunch. Commissioner Peters, taken from his home. District Attorney Matthews, led out of the courthouse. One by one, the corrupt pillars of Atlanta's justice system crumbled. People Caldwell had known for years, shared drinks with, traded favors with, all being paraded before cameras and handcuffs. His phone buzzed, making him jump. The caller ID showed his lawyer's number. Theodore. James Morton's voice was grave. "They're coming for you too. The FBI has warrants for everyone connected to Whitmore's operation." Caldwell's throat went dry. "I know. Your cooperation might help, but..." Morton paused. "You're going to face charges. Serious ones." "I understand." Caldwell's voice was barely a whisper. The TV continued its relentless coverage. Whitmore appeared again, this time being processed at the federal building downtown. His perfectly styled hair was disheveled, his confident stance replaced by stiff anger. Their eyes met through the screen. Predator turned prey. Caldwell remembered all the threats, all the subtle warnings, all the ways Whitmore had kept him under control. Now the man's empire was falling, and Caldwell would be buried in the rubble. He reached for the remote and clicked off the TV. The sudden silence felt heavy, oppressive. Empty boxes sat in the corner. He'd already started packing his office, knowing this day would come. Family photos were wrapped in newspaper, law books boxed up, his degrees and certificates carefully removed from the walls. The office that had been his domain for so many years now felt like a prison cell. He exhaled slowly, the sound echoing in the emptiness. The choice he'd made to expose everything couldn't be undone. Justice for Jasmine and Janelle meant facing justice himself. The phone on his desk rang again. This time it was courthouse security. "Judge Caldwell? There are federal agents here to see you." "Send them up," he replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. The marble halls of the courthouse felt different that Wednesday morning. Caldwell's footsteps, once commanding and confident, now echoed weakly as two federal agents guided him toward the Judicial Review Board chamber. His tie felt too tight, his suit too heavy. The room was smaller than he remembered, with dark wood panels and harsh fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sickly. 7 judges sat behind an elevated desk, their faces etched with disappointment and disgust. Chief Judge Samuel Carter, a man who had once called him friend, wouldn't meet his eyes. "Theodore James Caldwell," Chief Judge Carter's voice boomed through the chamber. "You stand before this board to answer for your conduct as a judge of the Superior Court." Caldwell's throat went dry. The chair they directed him to felt hard and uncomfortable, nothing like the plush leather seat he'd occupied for years. Papers rustled as the board members shuffled through their documents. One by one, they read out his sins, each case where he'd bent the law, each ruling he'd twisted for Whitmore's benefit. The Carter twins case was just the latest in a long line of corrupted justice. The list seemed endless. In the matter of Jasmine and Janelle Carter, Chief Judge Carter's voice caught slightly. "You knowingly convicted 2 innocent young women based on fabricated evidence." Sweat trickled down Caldwell's back. He wanted to explain, to tell them about his redemption, but the rules were clear. He was there to listen, not speak. "You have violated every ethical principle our profession holds sacred," another judge declared, her voice sharp with contempt. "You've made a mockery of justice itself." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Chief Judge Carter delivered the final blow. "By unanimous decision of this board, you are hereby permanently disbarred from the practice of law. You will never again serve as an officer of the court." The words hit him like physical blows, permanently disbarred. His career, everything he'd worked for, gone in an instant. "You will surrender your bar license immediately," Chief Judge Carter continued, not a trace of sympathy in his voice. "Your name will be struck from all court records and registries." Caldwell's hands trembled as he reached into his wallet and pulled out the small card that had defined his professional life for decades. He placed it on the table before him, unable to look at it one last time. The federal agent stepped forward, ready to escort him out. As he stood, Chief Judge Carter spoke one final time, his voice heavy. "You were meant to protect justice, Theodore. Instead, you corrupted it." The walk out of the chamber felt endless. Through the courthouse windows, he could see maintenance workers already removing his nameplate from the directory. Reporters clustered at the bottom of the courthouse steps, cameras ready. The heavy doors swung open and the media descended like vultures. Microphones thrust toward his face, questions overlapping in a cacophony of accusations and demands. "Judge Caldwell, how does it feel to lose everything? Do you regret what you did to those girls? What do you say to the families whose lives you ruined?" He kept his head down, letting the federal agents clear a path through the crowd. Behind him, the courthouse that had been his kingdom for so long stood tall and indifferent, already forgetting his name. Caldwell's fingers traced the worn edges of the motel room's remote control as he watched the scene unfold on the flickering TV screen. The cheap curtains let in strips of afternoon sunlight, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air. His suit jacket lay crumpled on the bed, a far cry from his once pristine appearance. On the screen, the prison gates opened with a metallic groan. Jasmine and Janelle Carter emerged, their matching blue dresses somehow still as pristine as the day of their trial. Their faces showed no bitterness, no anger, just quiet dignity. Eleanor Carter rushed forward, her Bible clutched to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped her arms around her daughters. "My babies," Eleanor sobbed, pulling them close. "Thank you, Lord, thank you." The twins held their mother tight, their own tears finally breaking through their composed facades. Cameras flashed around them, reporters shouting questions, but the family remained in their own world, wrapped in an embrace that spoke of months of separation and pain. Caldwell's throat tightened. He reached for the glass of water on the nightstand, his hand trembling slightly. The news anchor's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, the Carter twins have been released after evidence of judicial misconduct and corruption came to light. Michael Harrington stood at the courthouse steps, surrounded by microphones. His tie was slightly crooked, but his voice rang with conviction. This was an injustice that never should have happened. 2 innocent young women lost months of their lives because of corruption in our justice system. The camera panned back to Jasmine and Janelle. They stood tall, their hands clasped together, their mother's arms still around them. Reporters called out, "How do you feel about Judge Caldwell's confession? What are your plans now? Do you harbor any resentment?" Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite her tears. "We thank God for bringing the truth to light. We never lost faith." Jasmine and Janelle remained silent, but their expressions spoke volumes, not of hatred or vengeance, but of quiet strength. The same strength they'd shown in the courtroom when they'd whispered those words that had started it all. "We forgive you." Caldwell leaned back in the creaky motel chair, his eyes burning. The TV continued to replay the scene, the reunion, the tears, the triumph of truth over corruption. He watched as the Carter family walked away from the prison, away from the injustice he had helped create. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the motel room floor. Outside, cars rushed past on the highway, their sounds muffled by the thin walls. Caldwell stared at the ceiling, its water-stained tiles a stark reminder of how far he had fallen. But for the first time since this all began, the weight in his chest felt lighter. The twins were free. His conscience, though battered, could finally rest. He had lost everything, his career, his family, his reputation. But watching Eleanor embrace her daughters, he knew it had been worth it. Caldwell closed his eyes, letting the sounds of celebration from the TV wash over him. It was over. The price had been steep, but justice had finally prevailed. The harsh fluorescent light from the motel's exterior cast long shadows across the room when 3 sharp knocks broke the evening silence. Caldwell rose slowly from his chair, his joints stiff from hours of sitting. Through the peephole, he saw a young man in a crisp navy suit, briefcase in hand. Opening the door, Caldwell found himself face to face with Jonathan Pierce, the public defender assigned to his case. Pierce's clean-shaven face and earnest expression made him look barely out of law school. "Judge Caldwell," Pierce said, then caught himself. "Mr. Caldwell, I mean." "Come in," Caldwell replied, stepping aside. The small motel room felt even smaller with 2 people in it. Pierce placed his briefcase on the scratched laminate table and pulled out a thick manila folder. The sound of papers shuffling filled the room. "The State Bar filed their charges today," Pierce said, his voice steady but sympathetic. "They're not holding back." Caldwell sank into one of the rickety chairs. "Tell me." Pierce spread the documents across the table. Multiple counts of judicial misconduct, corruption, accepting bribes, obstruction of justice. He paused, looking up at Caldwell. "We have 2 options here. We can fight it, drag this through the courts for years, or ... "I'll plead guilty," Caldwell interrupted, his voice firm. Pierce blinked, clearly surprised by the quick response. "Mr. Caldwell, you need to understand what that means. We're looking at significant prison time, asset forfeiture, your pension gone, everything you've built." "Everything I built was on lies," Caldwell said quietly. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the stubble that had grown over the past few days. "I'm tired, Jonathan. Tired of running. Tired of pretending." Pierce pulled out another document, the plea agreement. The words, Guilty plea stood out in bold letters at the top. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Caldwell nodded, reaching for the pen Pierce offered. "Those girls spent months in prison because of me. The least I can do is face my punishment honestly. The prosecution might be willing to deal if we—" "No deals," Caldwell cut him off. "No more games. No more manipulation." Pierce watched as Caldwell began signing the various pages of the agreement. Each signature felt like another nail in the coffin of his old life, but somehow the weight on his shoulders began to lift. When he reached the final page, Caldwell paused, pen hovering over the signature line. In that moment, he thought of Margaret, who had abandoned him, of Caroline, who couldn't even look at him anymore, of Jasmine and Janelle, who had forgiven him before he'd even earned it. He signed his name one last time, the scratching of the pen against paper echoing in the quiet room. Pierce gathered the documents carefully, sliding them back into his briefcase. "I'll file these first thing in the morning." The fluorescent lights of Pete's coffee shop buzzed overhead as Caldwell sat alone in a corner booth, his weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of black coffee. The bitter liquid had long since gone stale, but he barely noticed. His attention was fixed on the newspaper spread before him, its bold headline screaming victory. "Whitmore denied bail, facing life in prison." The morning crowd shuffled around him, their chatter a distant hum. A waitress topped off his coffee without a word, probably not recognizing him without his judge's robes and authority. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the page, drinking in every detail of Whitmore's downfall. The article painted a devastating picture. Federal investigators had uncovered offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, each stuffed with millions in dirty money. They'd found encrypted files filled with blackmail material on half the city's elite. But most damning were the paper trails connecting Whitmore to dozens of rigged cases spanning 2 decades. Caldwell's coffee grew cold again as he read about evidence rooms being ransacked, years of case files being reviewed. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Prosecutors were calling it the largest judicial scandal in state history. The article detailed Whitmore's bail hearing. The man who once commanded rooms with a whisper had been led in wearing orange prison scrubs and chains. When the judge denied bail, citing flight risk and the severity of charges, Whitmore had apparently lost his composure, shouting threats until marshals dragged him away. A small smile tugged at Caldwell's lips. The mighty Daniel Whitmore, who had built his empire on threats and fear, was now just another inmate number. The man who had held Caldwell's strings for so long was facing life in federal prison. Caldwell scanned the list of charges: racketeering, conspiracy, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. Each count carried decades of potential prison time. The prosecutors were confident. They had paper trails, witness statements, and digital records. Whitmore's own meticulous record-keeping had become his undoing. The coffee shop's bell chimed as morning customers came and went. Outside, the city was waking up to its first real taste of justice in years. Caldwell folded the newspaper carefully, laid a few dollars on the table for his coffee, and stood up. He pushed open the glass door, stepping out into the crisp morning air. For the first time since he could remember, he walked without looking over his shoulder. Whitmore's shadow no longer loomed over the city, or him. The marble steps of the courthouse felt different under Caldwell's feet as he climbed them one last time. Gone was his flowing black robe, replaced by a simple gray suit that hung loose on his frame. His lawyer, Jonathan Pierce, walked beside him, briefcase in hand, maintaining a protective presence against the crowd of reporters that parted before them. Inside the courtroom, Caldwell's footsteps echoed differently too. Each click of his shoes against the polished floor reminded him of all the times he'd made this walk from the other direction, toward the judge's bench that now loomed before him like an accusation. The gallery buzzed with whispers and the scratch of reporters' pens. He recognized faces he'd seen 100 times before. Court reporters who once smiled at him, lawyers who once feared him, clerks who once rushed to open doors for him. Now they all stared with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. "All rise," the bailiff called out, his voice carrying the same authority Caldwell's once had. Judge Harrison Matthews entered, his expression granite hard as he took his seat. Caldwell felt a chill run through him. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself countless times. Theodore Caldwell, Judge Matthews began, his voice filling the hushed courtroom. You stand accused of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and tampering with evidence. Each charge landed like a physical blow. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, Caldwell replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Jonathan Pierce rose to speak, his argument for leniency well-crafted and passionate. He highlighted Caldwell's cooperation, his crucial role in exposing Whitmore's corruption, the risks he took to right his wrongs. The words washed over Caldwell as he stood perfectly still, eyes fixed forward. Judge Matthews listened in silence, his fingers steepled before him. When Pierce finished, the judge took a long moment before speaking, his gaze boring into Caldwell. Mr. Caldwell, he began, each word measured and heavy. You knowingly sentenced innocent people. You destroyed lives. The judge paused, letting the weight of those words settle. But your confession helped expose a deeply corrupt system. Caldwell's heart pounded as he waited for the sentence. The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. This court sentences you to 5 years of house arrest, loss of all judicial pensions, and a permanent ban from practicing law. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Pierce squeezed Caldwell's shoulder. It was better than they'd hoped for. But Caldwell barely felt it. All he could think about was how many times he'd been the one pronouncing sentence, never truly understanding the weight of those moments. As he walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed around him like angry bees. Microphones thrust toward his face, cameras flashing, voices calling out questions. One voice cut through the chaos. Do you feel justice was served? Caldwell paused mid-step. The question hung in the air, heavy with irony. He looked at the reporter who'd asked it, then at the courthouse steps he'd climbed so many times before. Without a word, he turned and walked away, leaving the chaos of questions behind him. The harsh fluorescent light from the kitchen cast long shadows across Caldwell's living room as he sat at his dining table, staring at the mounting pile of unpaid bills. His house arrest ankle monitor blinked steadily, a constant reminder of his new reality. The furniture around him seemed too big for the space now. Margaret had left him with the bulky pieces she didn't want, their emptiness echoing his isolation. His fingers traced the edge of an overdue electric bill. Without his judicial pension and with his assets frozen, the comfortable life he'd known was slipping away. The silence of the house pressed in on him, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. His heart quickened. He wasn't expecting anyone. Moving carefully to the entryway, he peered through the peephole, his breath caught in his throat. Caroline stood on his doorstep, her arms wrapped around herself against the evening chill. She looked so much like her mother had years ago, before the corruption and lies had poisoned everything. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the door. She stepped inside without a word, her eyes taking in the nearly empty house. Gone were the expensive paintings and decorative vases Margaret had collected. The walls were bare except for faded rectangles where frames had once hung. Caroline's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as she moved into the living room. The silence between them felt heavy, loaded with unspoken words. Caldwell watched his daughter, afraid to speak first, afraid to break whatever had brought her here. Finally, Caroline turned to face him. I read the case files, she said softly. I understand now. Her voice was careful, measured, but the raw anger from their last meeting had faded. Her expression was softer, though still guarded. Caldwell nodded, words failing him. What could he say to make up for years of moral compromise? How could he explain that her understanding meant more to him than his freedom? Caroline moved to the table, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a photograph, worn at the edges. In it, a younger Caldwell smiled broadly, holding a small Caroline on his shoulders at the park. Both of them were laughing, caught in a moment before everything went wrong. I don't know if we can fix this, she said, placing the photo carefully on the table. But I wanted you to have this. Caldwell stared at the photograph, his vision blurring slightly. He remembered that day, how simple everything had been, how pure his love for his daughter had felt before he'd let power corrupt him. Caroline adjusted her purse strap, moving toward the door. She paused in the entryway, looking back at him. The anger wasn't gone from her eyes, but something else had joined it, understanding, and perhaps the smallest seed of forgiveness. As the door closed behind her, Caldwell picked up the photograph with trembling hands. In that frozen moment from years ago, he saw something he thought he'd lost forever: hope. The autumn wind rustled through empty tree branches as Caldwell stood in his former driveway, watching the movers load the last of his belongings into a small rental truck. The space where his Mercedes had once gleamed now held only scattered leaves and memories of better days. His house arrest ankle monitor felt heavier than usual as he took one final look at the colonial-style home he'd lived in for 20 years. Inside, his footsteps echoed through bare rooms that had once showcased expensive furniture and carefully curated art pieces. The walls, stripped of family photos, revealed lighter patches where frames had hung. His fingers brushed against the height marks on the kitchen door frame where he'd tracked Caroline's growth over the years. The moving truck wasn't even half full. Most of his possessions had been sold to cover mounting legal fees and restitution payments. What remained fit into a handful of cardboard boxes, some clothes, basic kitchenware, and a few books he couldn't bear to part with. His new apartment sat above a laundromat in a tired neighborhood on the outskirts of Atlanta. The rent was all he could afford now, with his assets frozen and his pension stripped away. The bedroom window overlooked a parking lot, and the walls were thin enough that he could hear his neighbors' conversations. It was a far cry from his former life, but it was all he had left. Job applications piled up on his small desk, each one marked with rejection. Even fast food restaurants turned him away once they recognized his name. The media coverage had been thorough. Everyone knew the story of the corrupt judge who had finally confessed. Some praised his eventual honesty, but none were willing to hire him. Yesterday's mail had brought the wedding announcement, Margaret and some wealthy real estate developer. The glossy photo showed her beaming, wearing a pearl necklace he'd given her on their 15th anniversary. She looked younger somehow, unburdened. He'd crumpled the announcement and thrown it away, but fished it out later, smoothing the creases with trembling hands. Standing in his empty driveway now, Caldwell clutched the small ring of keys to his new apartment. 2 keys, not the dozen he'd once carried. No office key, no chambers key, no country club key. Just a front door and a mailbox. The movers closed the truck's rear door with a metallic clang that seemed to punctuate the end of his old life. He took one last look at the house. The "Sold" sign swayed gently in the breeze, and somewhere inside, a new family would soon make their own memories. His hand instinctively reached up to straighten his tie, but found only an open collar. He hadn't worn a tie since his sentencing. The keys felt foreign in his palm as he turned toward his apartment-bound future. No more, "Your Honor." No more power lunches. No more respect earned through fear and influence. Just Theodore Caldwell, disgraced former judge, starting over with nothing but his name. And even that wasn't worth much anymore. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows of Caldwell's small apartment kitchen. The room was bare except for a rickety wooden table, 2 mismatched chairs, and a few basic appliances. Gone were the marble countertops and designer furniture of his old life. He sat there in worn pajamas, mechanically chewing dry toast while scanning the morning paper. The sound of the mail slot's metallic clatter made him jump. These days, mail usually meant bills or rejection letters from potential employers. He pushed back his chair with a sigh, his ankle monitor catching slightly on the table leg. The envelope lay alone on the worn welcome mat. Plain white, no return address. His heart quickened. Anonymous mail usually meant hate messages these days. Still, something about this one felt different. He picked it up carefully, noting the precise handwriting. The paper inside was simple notebook paper, folded neatly into thirds. As he unfolded it, his hands began to tremble. "Dear Judge Caldwell, we still forgive you. What happened to us was wrong, but your courage in coming forward helped expose the truth. Our mother always taught us that forgiveness isn't just about the other person. It's about finding peace within yourself. May you find that peace. With sincere hopes for your healing, Jasmine and Janelle Carter." The words blurred as tears filled his eyes. He stumbled back to his kitchen chair, clutching the letter like a lifeline. Their forgiveness, so pure, so undeserved, hit him harder than any punishment the courts had given him. His chest tightened as a sob worked its way up his throat. All the guilt, shame, and regret he'd been carrying crashed over him in waves. He thought of their composed faces in court, their quiet dignity even as he sentenced them to prison. Now here they were, extending grace to the very man who had wronged them. Caldwell pressed his palms against his eyes, but the tears wouldn't stop. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, he truly broke down. Not from self-pity or fear, but from the overwhelming weight of their mercy. The letter trembled in his grip as he read it again and again. The morning light caught on his tears, casting tiny rainbows across the paper. Their words of forgiveness felt like both a blessing and a burden, showing him the kind of person he should have been all along. He sat there for a long time, shoulders shaking, letting himself really feel the magnitude of what they'd given him. Not just forgiveness, but a chance to finally forgive himself. The bell above the door chimed softly as Caldwell stepped into the modest law office. The space was small but neat, with filing cabinets lining the walls and a few plastic chairs in the waiting area. The carpet was worn and the air smelled of coffee and old papers, a far cry from his former chambers at the courthouse. The sign on the inner office door read, "Malcolm Reed, Attorney at Law," in simple black letters. Through the glass partition, Caldwell could see a young black attorney at his desk, poring over case files. Reed looked up as Caldwell entered, his sharp eyes narrowing with recognition. His posture stiffened slightly, and he set down his pen with deliberate slowness. "Judge Caldwell," Reed said, his tone careful and measured. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Caldwell stood awkwardly in the doorway, his hands clasped in front of him. The fine suits and commanding presence of his judge days were gone, replaced by a simple blazer and an air of humility. "I'd like to help," Caldwell said, clearing his throat. "Pro bono." Reed leaned back in his chair, studying Caldwell's face. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken history. "You put a lot of people behind bars," Reed finally said. His voice wasn't accusatory, just stating facts. "Now you want to get them out?" Caldwell nodded, meeting Reed's gaze steadily. "If you'll have me." Reed drummed his fingers on the desk, considering. The wall clock ticked loudly in the silence. Photos of Reed's family sat on his desk, next to a stack of case files and a coffee mug emblazoned with "Justice Never Sleeps." After what felt like an eternity, Reed reached for one of the files on his desk. He held it for a moment, then slowly slid it across to Caldwell. Caldwell picked up the file with careful hands. Inside were the details of another wrongful conviction, someone else's life derailed by a broken system he had once been part of. For the first time in years, he felt something stirring inside him. Purpose. Reed watched him intently, gauging his reaction. "Let's see what you can do with that," he said quietly. The wooden benches creaked beneath Caldwell as he shifted nervously in his seat. The community courtroom was smaller than his old domain. No marble columns or polished oak, just simple walls and fluorescent lighting. His hands felt clammy as he gripped his knees, his heart pounding against his ribs. The door's hinges squeaked and time seemed to slow. Jasmine and Janelle Carter stepped inside, sunlight streaming behind them. Their matching blue dresses caught the light, reminding him painfully of that day a year ago. Their faces were softer now, unburdened by prison walls. They carried themselves with quiet dignity, their twin bond evident in their matching strides. Caldwell's legs shook as he stood, his mouth opened but no words came. What could he possibly say to them? The weight of his crimes pressed down on his shoulders, making him feel small and insignificant. The twins paused, looking at each other in that silent way sisters do. Then, their faces broke into gentle smiles that reached their eyes. "We always believed in you," they said in unison, their voices carrying no trace of bitterness. Caldwell's throat constricted. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes. He bowed his head, unable to meet their gaze, overwhelmed by their capacity for forgiveness. He didn't deserve their kindness, he knew that, yet here they were offering it freely. Without hesitation, Jasmine and Janelle stepped forward. Their arms encircled him in a warm embrace, and Caldwell felt something inside him break, not in pain, but in release. Their forgiveness wrapped around him like a healing balm. He closed his eyes tightly, holding on to them as though they were anchoring him to earth. Their embrace felt like absolution, like a chance at redemption he never thought possible. In this simple community courtroom, far from the power and prestige he once wielded, Caldwell found something far more valuable: the possibility of grace. The harsh bathroom light cast shadows across Caldwell's weathered face as he gripped the edge of the porcelain sink. His reflection stared back at him, a man he barely recognized anymore. Gone was the crisp black robe, the perfectly combed hair, the air of untouchable authority. Instead, he saw deep lines etched around his eyes, silver threading through his temples, and shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of countless wrong decisions. He leaned closer, studying every detail. The expensive suits were replaced by a simple button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled. His once commanding posture had softened, but it was his eyes that held his attention longest. They weren't cold anymore. The steel-gray gaze that once intimidated witnesses and lawyers alike had mellowed into something gentler, more human. Running water dripped steadily from the faucet, creating a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. His fingers traced the crow's feet around his eyes, marks of stress, of sleepless nights spent wrestling with guilt, but also of recent genuine smiles, the kind he hadn't allowed himself in years. The bathroom mirror had witnessed his darkest moments over the past year, nights of self-loathing, mornings of crushing regret. But tonight was different. Tonight, he saw beyond the shame. In place of the powerful judge who had lost everything, he saw a man learning to live with his mistakes, learning to make amends. Jasmine and Janelle's embrace still lingered, their forgiveness a weight lifted rather than a burden added. Their grace had cracked something open inside him, not healing exactly, but the beginning of acceptance. His reflection blurred slightly as his eyes welled up. He didn't fight the tears this time. They weren't tears of self-pity or despair, but of gratitude, of release. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the dripping faucet. The words weren't meant for his reflection, but for two young women in blue dresses who had shown him that redemption was possible, that forgiveness, even when undeserved, could light the way forward. He straightened up, wiping his face with a trembling hand. The past would always be there, in court records, in newspaper archives, in the memories of those he'd wronged. But as he stepped back from the mirror, he knew it would no longer define him. The man in the reflection wasn't just an ex-judge, a fallen power broker, or a cautionary tale. He was simply Theodore Caldwell, starting again. The fluorescent lights of the small courtroom buzzed overhead as Caldwell sat beside Malcolm Reed at the defense table. His cheap suit felt tight around his shoulders, a far cry from the tailored robes he once wore. Beside them, James Porter, their client, twisted his hands nervously in his lap. The man had spent 8 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Reed leaned over, whispering, "You did good work on this one, Ted." Caldwell nodded slightly, his throat tight. The evidence they'd uncovered had been damning. Botched DNA analysis, witness testimonies that didn't add up, a rushed investigation that ignored key facts. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension. "All rise." Judge Martinez entered, her face unreadable as she took her seat. Caldwell's heart pounded. He'd stood in her position countless times before, holding others' fates in his hands. Now he could barely breathe as he waited for her decision. "In the matter of State versus James Porter," Judge Martinez began, her voice clear and steady, "having reviewed the new evidence presented by the defense." Porter's wife gripped her daughter's hand in the front row. Their faces were drawn with worry and hope. "This court finds the defendant not guilty of all charges." The words hung in the air for a moment before Porter collapsed forward, sobbing. His wife and daughter rushed to him, wrapping their arms around him as tears streamed down their faces. The sound of their joyful crying filled the small courtroom. Caldwell's hands trembled as he gathered his papers. He felt lightheaded, almost dizzy with relief. This wasn't about him. It was about Porter and his family. But he couldn't help feeling something crack open inside his chest. This was what justice should have looked like all along. Reed clapped him on the shoulder. "We make a good team," he said quietly. "Ready for the next case?" Porter turned to them, his face wet with tears. "Thank you," he managed to say. "Thank you both so much." His wife hugged them, her gratitude too deep for words. Caldwell stepped back, letting the family have their moment. He watched as Porter held his daughter close, making up for 8 years of missed embraces. Other lawyers might have stayed to bask in the victory, but Caldwell knew better. This moment wasn't about the attorneys, it was about a family being made whole again. As he moved toward the back of the courtroom, he caught Judge Martinez's eye. She gave him a small nod, not of friendship or forgiveness, but of professional acknowledgement. He had done his job well today. For the first time since his fall from grace, he felt truly useful again. The morning sun painted golden streaks through the oak trees as Caldwell walked along the winding park path. His pace was unhurried, relaxed, so different from the rushed, anxious steps he'd taken in his previous life. The crisp autumn air filled his lungs, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and fresh-cut grass. He paused near a wooden bench, watching children play on the nearby swings. Their laughter echoed across the park, pure and untainted. It reminded him of Caroline when she was young, before the weight of his choices had created a chasm between them. These days they met for coffee once a month. Small steps, but healing ones. A middle-aged woman approached him, her steps hesitant. She wore a simple blue dress that reminded him of the Carter twins. Her hands fidgeted with her purse strap as she drew closer. "Excuse me," she started, her voice uncertain. "Aren't you the judge who turned things around?" Caldwell felt the familiar tightness in his chest, not from shame anymore, but from something softer, more bittersweet. He offered a faint smile, the kind that reached his eyes now. "I used to be," he replied gently. "Now I just try to help." The woman nodded, understanding filling her expression. "My brother. He was one of the cases you helped overturn last year, with Mr. Reed." Caldwell remembered. They'd helped free 3 wrongfully convicted men in the past year alone. Each case felt like paying back a debt he could never fully repay, but trying mattered more than succeeding. "How is he doing?" Caldwell asked softly. "He's good, getting better every day." She smiled warmly. "Thank you for choosing to do the right thing, even when it cost you everything." Caldwell absorbed her words, feeling their weight but not their burden. The guilt that had once crushed him had transformed into purpose. His disgrace had become his salvation. "Your brother deserved justice," he said simply. "They all did." The woman squeezed his arm gently before walking away. Caldwell watched her go, then turned back toward the path. The wind brushed cool against his face, carrying away the last remnants of who he used to be. For the first time in years, he smiled and meant it. Not because he'd been forgiven, but because he'd finally learned to live with the truth of who he was and who he could still become. If you enjoyed the story of Theodore, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.